G'day. Okay, so this will be an amateur's guide to repairing a Sega Game Gear with faulty capacitors. It's not going to be a step-by-step guide, but I will show you all the things you need to have, some of the processes, and what you need to do to get the job done. Before we start, you'll need to have a bunch of things. So hopefully you have a workspace somewhere, soldering iron, some solder braid, flux paste, an extraction fan, some rubbing alcohol, cotton, some snips, tweezers, a pryer or flathead screwdriver, and a Phillips screwdriver, a Gamebit, a brush, and a magnifying glass, and multimeter. They're optional. They're sort of only if you need to diagnose issues. So kicking off, up here is the Gamebit, and all the rest of the screws are regular Phillips head screws. So you'll only need the Gamebit screwdriver for that top part. There's also some screws inside here, inside the battery covers. So start with the Phillips head up here, and we'll just zoom ahead. So you don't need to be super careful opening it up. The cable and connectors are pretty sturdy. There's 3 of them. They're there and there. So this is the power connector. So we just pry that out. And this next one here is the audio board. And the last one, the little 2-prong one, is the speaker connector. So you need to know which version of the Game Gear you have to order the right capacitors. So this is the Twin-ASIC chip version. You can see the 2 chips on the right. You can see the serial number there on the left, which means it is the VA-1 Twin-ASIC revision. There's a website in the links below called Console 5, which will give you all you need to know. So we continue on with removing this shield here on the back of the Game Gear. That'll let us get to the audio board and the power board. Looking at the back first, so this is the audio board, and you can see it's quite, those 3 main capacitors are quite corroded. Just around the edge you can see the electrolytic fluid has leaked and it started to corrode some of the parts underneath, which isn't good. Nothing is obvious on the other side yet. And just a quick look at the main board. Nothing really stand out here. Some of the feet on these capacitors here, you can very barely see that they are slightly corroded. So there are no obvious signs of corrosion on the main board, but that doesn't mean that the capacitors are good. We'll just fast forward here through removing the audio board. Just these 2 screws, and lift the board up. Just make sure you don't lose those screws. Just flip that upside down and dump them out. Alright, bit of a closer look. You can see the corrosion around the bottom of the capacitors. So the fluid is leaked, and the pads of the capacitors have corroded. You can see it around there and there. So all these capacitors will need to be changed. The 3 big ones and the 2 smaller ones. Just shimmy this protector off. and that eventually comes out. 2 screws as well, similar to the other side. And taking a closer look at this, so this is the power board. It doesn't actually look as obvious of corrosion or leakage like the audio board. So I'll take a closer look at this later on. Might actually try and run it without replacing it first. But first things first, let's run through the replacement of a single capacitor on the audio board. So just get your little snips and snip this capacitor off. So you can snip it down low, but not right underneath. So you're actually cutting the bottom half of it, and you're leaving the legs intact and still soldered to the board. So this is the bottom of the capacitor, including the plastic sort of seat underneath. The style of capacitor is called a surface mount, which means it doesn't have legs that go through the board. They just mount to pads on the top side. So just break up that plastic seat bit. There we go, to reveal the corrosion. And you can still see the 2 feet of the capacitor are still soldered to the pads, so we'll need to lift those. So just grab some flux paste. There's several benefits of using this. Basically, it'll just help you do a better job. You can be as liberal as you want with this flux paste, but the more you put on, the more you have to clean off. So it's just good to keep it neat and tidy. And sometimes it's good to add a bit of solder to the pad, especially if it's quite corroded, just to help lift that remaining foot of the capacitor easier. So just apply a bit of pressure there, and so I've got my soldering iron set a bit low. So depending on the temperature of your iron, it may take a little while, but don't put too much pressure because you don't want to lift the pad. Alrighty, so now just a bit of solder braid to lift the remaining solder. Just slightly move that apart, and then a bit of cleaning with some rubbing alcohol, and then you've got nice clean pads ready for a new capacitor. So if you're doing this for the first time, it is good to do them one at a time, but in the case of this audio board, it is actually easier to remove multiple capacitors, as it just gives you a bit more working space to resolder your capacitor. So there's a bunch of different ways to do surface mount ones. I'm trying a new method here, which is putting flux paste on one end, and then a bit of solder on the tip, and then having that solder on either side. Just clean off our solder. And again, normally you have the solder attached to what you're soldering to, but in the case of these surface mount capacitors, you do need to hold them down. So I do find that setting your soldering iron with a lower temperature and pre-heating the solder works okay. So just holding down with a bit of force there, and then the solder should eventually grab onto the leg. I did find that after doing this one that I did end up applying flux paste to both sides for the rest of the board, and even the main board. It was just a bit finicky doing it this way, and I found that it was a better approach. So here I am applying the flux paste after the fact, but I recommend you apply it to both sides of the pads before you put your capacitor down. I'm not going to show every capacitor on this audio board, but you pretty much repeat the process for the others. And in summary, pretty much you've got three options. You can apply flux paste and then try and get solder flow happening on the ends of the legs, or you can snip the bottom plastic part off, which I didn't want to do for this video, or you can actually use through-hole capacitors and bend the legs at angles. Give the board a bit of a clean now. Fast forward it ahead to the main board. So if you just look at the pads under some of those capacitors, you can just see slight corrosion happening on the pad. So these will be replaced. And usually dealing with capacitors this old, it is better to replace them all, even though they may not show signs of wear. See, that one's done as well. It's going to be a bit harder to see in there, but that one has the same symptoms. Alrighty, so these are also surface mount, but they're a bit easier to get a hold of. The entire board has surface mount capacitors, and you don't need to use the surface mount type, as I'll show you shortly. You can just use regular through-hole capacitors as replacements. So that's the old one, and it's just got a plastic case there. Add some flux paste. And again, for this main board, I'm not going to show every single capacitor because that would take quite a while, but you can use this process basically for every capacitor on the main board. So here I'm just using tweezers to try and grab the end as it loosens, rather than put pressure on the leg of the capacitor. But it's just lifted there on its own. And same on the other side. Again, you may want to do capacitors on this board one at a time so you don't mix up which capacitor you're replacing. Otherwise, if you've got a list in front of you of what goes where, it might just be easier to do them all at once, remove them all at once. It also gives you a bit more working room. So just a bit of solder braid here. Remove the old solder. and some rubbing alcohol to clean that up. Looking nice and shiny there. Let's clean a bit of that residue plastic off. The cases of those capacitors are usually glued on. So just skipping ahead here. I think this is a good example of how to deal with capacitors on the main board. So again, I like to just tack one side down. And then go back and make it perfect. And this is a good example of this board because there's two capacitors in close range that actually go perpendicular to each other. And they obviously have to lay flat, so the solution is to lay them across each other. So just using the pryer there to lay that flat and make sure the solder is perfect. If you do use this method of crossing capacitors, just make sure the legs are clear of any resistors or anything else on the board. So you sort of just work out the spacing here. You know how long the legs need to be. Sort of eye it off there. That looks about right. So we just want to use that pryer to hold down the legs and bend them to the correct angle, like so. And then we'll just hold it in place and just tack one side down and a bit more solder. For the other side. Like so. And just make sure your solders are holding. That first tack leg was a bit loose, so I'm just going to add some solder there. And again, normally you would be holding the solder and the iron onto what you're soldering at the same time, but with this pad type you want to apply pressure usually to hold down the capacitor. I think it's just easier if you've got the right soldering iron and a temperature adjuster. You can just apply it to the iron straight off and hold down your capacitor with the other hand. And that's looking pretty good. So it's almost all of the capacitors on this side of the board. So I'm going to show this one as well because it is in a bit of an odd space. We could have cut the legs really short, but I chose to sort of leave them longer and actually bend the capacitor back over itself, which is another way of doing things. You can see there, if you sort of cut it short, it would foul on the back of the directional pad ground there, which is the gold circle. So you can't obstruct those. So we've just cut the legs to length. And we'll tack down one side just lightly. And the other side is a bit close to the capacitor, so we're just going to use that pryer to align the leg correctly. Alrighty, that's looking good. So we still need to bend it back away from that D-pad ground. So we essentially can just use the pryer, just lightly tap where you want it bent and bend it back over itself. Or we can use something round. Tweezers perhaps. Alrighty, that looks pretty good. And the another example of a capacitor on the other side of the main board. Once again, just got a length issue, so we're just going to snip them to the correct length. Just getting the right amount of solder there on the end of the iron. And we'll just grab our pryer to hold down the legs. If you don't have one of these flat pryers, you can just use a wide flathead screwdriver. Works pretty well. And that's one side done. And a bit more solder for the other side. If you don't have an adjustable temperature soldering iron, you might need to do this another way. Generally they run a bit too hot and you'll get your solder on the end there and it will start to smoke a fair bit and run a bit hot, but I find that around the 300 degree mark is good for this approach. Alrighty, that doesn't look too bad. A little too much solder on the right hand side there, but that's fine. And the final result. If you've got any questions or need any help, just put them down in the comments below. Thanks for watching, guys. I'll catch you next time.